The morning mist hung heavy over Buckingham Palace as Commander James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he knew would be the most difficult day of his 30-year career. The red fabric felt heavier than usual, each golden button catching the pale sunlight that filtered through the ornate windows of the guardhouse. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he fastened his sword belt, a tremor that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the burden he was about to carry. James had served 3 monarchs during his distinguished career, but none had commanded his respect and devotion quite like Queen Elizabeth. Her passing 6 months ago had left a void in the palace that seemed to echo through every corridor, every room, and most painfully, through the hearts of those who had sworn to protect her. The transition to King Charles had been smooth enough, but there were complications that the public never saw, shadows that danced behind the gilded walls of the monarchy. The issue had started small, as most palace controversies did. A missing brooch here, a misplaced tiara there. The crown jewels collection was vast and complex, with pieces dating back centuries, each one catalogued and accounted for with military precision. James had overseen this inventory process countless times, his trained eye catching discrepancies that others might miss. But over the past few months, the discrepancies had grown from minor clerical errors to glaring absences that could no longer be explained away. The Queen Consort, Camilla, had been granted access to certain pieces from the collection, as was her right and tradition. Royal protocol dictated that the monarch's spouse could wear selected jewels for state functions and important ceremonies. However, the borrowing system required meticulous documentation, with each piece signed out and returned within specified timeframes. This system had worked flawlessly for decades under Queen Elizabeth's watchful eye. But something had changed. James pulled out a worn leather folder from his desk drawer, the same folder that had kept him awake for countless nights over the past month. Inside were photocopies of borrowing records, insurance documents, and most damning of all, photographs of pieces that should have been returned, but remained conspicuously absent from the royal collection. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, Princess Diana's favorite piece, had been checked out for a state dinner 3 months ago and never returned. The Queen Mother's diamond Riviere necklace had similarly vanished after a charity gala, along with several other pieces of immeasurable historical and monetary value. The palace staff whispered in corners about the missing jewels, but James was one of the few with access to the complete picture. His position as commander of the Royal Guard gave him clearance to view inventory reports, insurance assessments, and most importantly, the borrowing logs that painted a troubling pattern. Each missing piece could be traced back to one person, and that realization had been eating at him like acid for weeks. He had tried the diplomatic approach first, sending polite inquiries through proper channels. Palace protocol demanded respect for hierarchy, and one did not simply march up to the Queen Consort with accusations. James had submitted formal requests for inventory updates, suggested gentle reminders about return policies, and even arranged for additional storage facilities in case space was an issue. Each attempt had been met with deflection, excuses, or outright silence. The pressure was mounting from unexpected quarters. The Royal Collection Trust, responsible for managing the Crown's artistic treasures, had begun asking pointed questions about the missing pieces. Insurance companies were conducting their annual audits, and discrepancies this significant could not be hidden indefinitely. More personally troubling for James was the knowledge that he was ultimately responsible for the security and accounting of these priceless artifacts. His signature was on many of the borrowing authorizations, making him potentially liable for losses that could amount to tens of millions of pounds. But beyond the monetary value and professional implications lay something deeper that drove James forward. These jewels were not merely expensive accessories or museum pieces. They were living connections to British history, symbols of continuity that linked the present monarchy to centuries of tradition. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara had been worn by Princess Diana at some of her most iconic public appearances, making it not just valuable but emotionally significant to millions of people around the world. To see such pieces treated with apparent disregard felt like a betrayal of everything the Crown represented. James had served in Northern Ireland and Afghanistan before joining the Royal Guard, facing down armed terrorists and insurgents without flinching. Yet the prospect of confronting Camilla about the missing jewels filled him with a different kind of dread. This was not about physical courage, but about institutional loyalty, duty and the crushing weight of doing what was right even when it meant challenging power itself. The tipping point had come 3 days earlier, when the Royal Collection Trust had formally requested a complete audit of all loaned pieces. James knew that such an audit would expose the full extent of the missing inventory, creating a scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation at a time when public support was already fragile. King Charles was working hard to establish his reign and modernize the institution, but revelations about missing crown jewels could overshadow all his efforts and provide ammunition for Republican critics. That morning, James had made his decision. He would give Camilla one final opportunity to resolve the situation quietly before the audit began. It was not a choice he made lightly, knowing full well that challenging a member of the royal family could end his career and destroy his reputation. But his oath of service was not just to individuals, but to the institution of the monarchy itself, and sometimes protecting that institution required difficult choices. As he prepared to leave the guardhouse, James caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him showed the strain of recent weeks in new lines around his eyes, and a tension in his jaw that had become permanent. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his cap, and picked up the leather folder that contained the evidence of what had become the most serious crisis of his career. Outside, the tourists were already gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony, their cameras ready to capture the pageantry and tradition that made the British monarchy such a global fascination. None of them could imagine the drama unfolding behind the scenes, the quiet crisis that threatened to undermine everything they had come to witness. The private secretary's office felt smaller than usual as James waited for his appointment with Sir Michael Davies, one of the most influential figures in the palace hierarchy. The room was filled with the quiet sounds of efficient administration, the soft clicking of keyboards and the rustle of papers that kept the machinery of monarchy running smoothly. James had requested this meeting through proper channels, but he knew that his real message would have to be delivered carefully, with the kind of diplomatic language that palace life demanded. Sir Michael entered with his characteristic brisk efficiency, a man in his 60s whose silver hair and sharp suit spoke of decades spent navigating the treacherous waters of royal protocol. He had served both Queen Elizabeth and King Charles with unwavering loyalty, earning a reputation as someone who could handle delicate situations with discretion and wisdom. His expression was polite but guarded as he gestured for James to sit down. The conversation began with pleasantries about the weather and upcoming state visits, the kind of small talk that allowed both men to assess each other's mood and intentions. James knew that Sir Michael was already aware of the inventory discrepancies, palace communication networks being far more efficient than most people realized. The question was how much he knew and what he was prepared to do about it. James laid out his concerns with military precision, presenting the evidence in chronological order and avoiding any direct accusations. He spoke of missing pieces, incomplete returns, and the growing pressure from external auditors. Sir Michael listened with the poker face of a career diplomat, occasionally making notes but revealing nothing of his thoughts. When James finished, the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Sir Michael's response was measured and careful. He acknowledged the seriousness of the situation while emphasizing the need for absolute discretion. Palace scandals had a way of spiraling out of control, he reminded James, and the monarchy could not afford another crisis so soon after the transition. He suggested that perhaps there had been miscommunications, that the missing pieces might be in secure storage facilities that were not immediately accessible for inventory purposes. But James had done his homework too thoroughly to be satisfied with such explanations. He pulled out photographs from his folder, images of empty display cases and storage compartments where priceless pieces should have been resting. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara alone was worth millions, but its historical significance made it truly irreplaceable. He had personally overseen its placement in the secure vault after what was supposed to be its final wearing, only to discover weeks later that it had been removed without proper authorization. The tension in the room shifted as Sir Michael realized that James was not going to be placated with vague reassurances. The commander had clearly spent considerable time documenting the situation, and his evidence was too compelling to dismiss. Sir Michael's expression grew more serious as he absorbed the full implications of what James was telling him. This was not a minor administrative error, but a systematic pattern that could not be explained by simple oversight. James pressed his advantage carefully, explaining that the upcoming audit would expose these discrepancies within days. The Royal Collection Trust was already asking pointed questions, and the insurance companies were demanding updated inventories for their annual assessments. Once the audit began, there would be no way to contain the information or manage its release. The story would inevitably leak to the press, creating exactly the kind of scandal that everyone wanted to avoid. Sir Michael asked pointed questions about the security of the evidence James had gathered, clearly concerned about who else might have access to this information. James assured him that he had been discreet, but emphasized that discretion had its limits. Other members of the Royal Guard were beginning to notice the discrepancies, and the cleaning staff who maintained the jewelry storage areas had started asking innocent questions about missing pieces. The conversation took on an increasingly urgent tone as both men realized they were dealing with a situation that could spiral beyond their control. Sir Michael had handled many crises during his career, from royal divorces to political scandals, but this felt different. The missing jewels represented not just a financial loss, but a potential breach of trust that could undermine public confidence in the monarchy's stewardship of national treasures. James suggested that a quiet resolution might still be possible if the missing pieces could be returned before the formal audit began. He emphasized his respect for all members of the royal family, while making it clear that his primary loyalty was to the institution itself. The crown jewels belonged to the nation, not to any individual, and their protection was a sacred trust that transcended personal relationships or palace politics. Sir Michael's response revealed the delicate position he found himself in. As a senior advisor, he had to balance multiple competing interests while protecting the monarchy's reputation. He could not simply ignore James's evidence, but neither could he move against a member of the royal family without absolute certainty and careful preparation. The political implications were staggering, potentially affecting not just Camilla but King Charles himself. The meeting concluded with an agreement that James would maintain his silence for 48 hours while Sir Michael explored options for a discreet resolution. It was a compromise that satisfied neither man completely, but it provided a brief window for diplomacy before more drastic measures became necessary. James left the office with mixed feelings, knowing that he had done his duty in reporting the situation, but uncertain about whether the palace hierarchy would take the decisive action that the crisis demanded. As he walked through the palace corridors, James noticed details that had become familiar over 3 decades of service. The portraits of past monarchs seemed to watch him with knowing eyes, reminders of the centuries of tradition he had sworn to protect. The weight of history felt heavier than usual, pressing down on his shoulders as he contemplated the possible consequences of the path he had chosen. That evening, James sat in his modest flat near the palace, reviewing his options and preparing for what might come next. He had served his country with honor in military conflicts around the world, but this quiet crisis felt more personally challenging than anything he had faced on foreign battlefields. The enemy this time was not external, but came from within the very institution he had dedicated his life to protecting, making every decision fraught with moral complexity and emotional weight. The 48 hours passed like a slow-moving storm, each minute bringing James closer to a confrontation he had hoped to avoid. Sir Michael's promised resolution had not materialized, and the scheduled audit was now less than 24 hours away. The Royal Collection Trust had already sent their advance team to set up equipment and review preliminary documentation. There was no more time for diplomatic solutions or quiet negotiations behind closed doors. James had spent the previous evening going through his service record, reading old commendations and looking at photographs from his military career. The young soldier who had enlisted 35 years ago would never have imagined finding himself in this position, preparing to challenge the royal family he had sworn to protect. But service had taught him that duty sometimes required difficult choices, and loyalty to an institution was more important than loyalty to any individual, no matter how powerful. The call came at 7 in the morning, just as James was finishing his breakfast of tea and toast in the palace kitchens. Sir Michael's voice was strained and formal, as he requested an immediate meeting in his office. James knew from the tone that the news would not be good, but he finished his tea anyway, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before what might be his final official act as commander of the Royal Guard. Sir Michael looked like he had not slept, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the stress that had consumed the past 2 days. The silver-haired diplomat gestured for James to sit down, but remained standing himself, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. His first words confirmed James's worst fears. The missing pieces had not been returned, and Camilla's representatives had been evasive when approached about the inventory discrepancies. The conversation that followed revealed the complex web of relationships and obligations that made palace life so challenging to navigate. Sir Michael had spoken with several senior advisors, including some who had direct access to King Charles. The consensus was clear. The situation could not be allowed to explode into a public scandal, but neither could it be simply ignored. The missing jewels represented too significant a loss to sweep under the carpet, and the upcoming audit would expose everything regardless of their preferences. James listened as Sir Michael outlined the impossible position they all found themselves in. The palace could not be seen as covering up the loss of national treasures, but neither could they allow a crisis that might destabilize the monarchy during its crucial transition period. The media would seize on any hint of scandal involving Camilla, whose relationship with the public remained complicated years after her marriage to Charles. A story about missing crown jewels would dominate headlines for months, overshadowing every positive initiative the new reign had planned. The discussion turned to practical matters of damage control and crisis management. Sir Michael had consulted with legal experts about the palace's options, and the advice had been sobering. The missing pieces were insured, but any insurance claim would require a full investigation that could not be kept secret. The police might become involved, turning a private matter into a criminal investigation with all the media attention that would bring. James found himself in the unexpected position of offering reassurance to his superior. He suggested that a direct approach might still be possible, one final attempt to resolve the situation before the scandal became public. If Camilla could be convinced to return the missing pieces immediately, the audit results could be managed and the crisis contained. It would require someone with the authority and credibility to make such a request, but it was their last chance for a quiet resolution. Sir Michael's response surprised James with its directness. The palace hierarchy had already considered this approach, but no one wanted to take responsibility for what amounted to accusing the queen consort of theft. Such an accusation, even if made privately, could destroy careers and create permanent enemies within the royal family. The political implications were staggering, potentially affecting relationships that had taken years to build and repair. But James had reached a point where political considerations seemed less important than fundamental questions of right and wrong. He volunteered to make the approach himself, accepting full responsibility for the consequences. His position as commander of the Royal Guard gave him the authority to address security matters directly, and his long service record provided credibility that might make such a confrontation more palatable. The weight of the decision settled on both men as they contemplated the risks involved. James would be putting his career and reputation on the line, while Sir Michael would be sanctioning an unprecedented breach of palace protocol. But the alternative was worse, allowing the audit to proceed and watching helplessly as the scandal exploded into public view. Sir Michael spent several minutes reviewing the legal and political implications of James's proposal. He consulted documents and made several phone calls, each conversation conducted in the coded language that palace staff used when discussing sensitive matters. Finally, he turned back to James with an expression that mixed respect with deep concern. The authorization came with strict conditions. James would have one opportunity to address the situation directly with Camilla, but he would have to do so through proper channels and with appropriate respect for her position. Any conversation would need to be conducted with witnesses present, and detailed records would have to be kept of everything that was said. If the approach failed, James would be on his own, with no support from the palace hierarchy. James accepted these conditions without hesitation, knowing that they represented the best chance for resolving the crisis before it destroyed lives and reputations. He had faced enemy fire in foreign conflicts, but this felt more personally dangerous because so much depended on his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of palace. politics while remaining true to his principles. The meeting concluded with arrangements for James to request an audience with Camilla that afternoon. The timing was crucial because the audit was scheduled to begin the following morning, leaving no room for delay or diplomatic niceties. Sir Michael wished him luck with an expression that suggested he would need all the help he could get. As James left the office, he felt the weight of 30 years of service pressing down on his shoulders. The corridors of Buckingham Palace had become familiar territory over the decades, but now they felt like a battlefield where he was about to fight the most important engagement of his career. Everything he had worked for and believed in would be tested in the next few hours. The Queen Consort's private sitting room was decorated in soft pastels and filled with personal photographs that spoke of a life lived in the public eye. Camilla sat behind an ornate mahogany desk, her posture regal despite the casual afternoon dress she wore. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her expression carried the practiced composure of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations. She had agreed to see James immediately, which suggested that she understood the urgency of the situation better than her previous evasive responses had indicated. James entered the room with 2 witnesses, as protocol demanded. Lady Sarah Morrison, Camilla's private secretary, and Sir David Thompson, a senior equerry who had served the royal family for over 2 decades. The presence of witnesses would ensure that any conversation could be properly documented and would protect all parties from later disputes about what was actually said. The formal nature of the meeting sent a clear signal that this was not a casual social call, but an official matter of serious importance. The opening pleasantries were brief and strained, both parties understanding that they were dancing around a topic that could not be avoided indefinitely. Camilla inquired about James's health and recent duties with the kind of polite interest that royal family members were trained to display. James responded appropriately while internally rehearsing the words he would need to speak, knowing that his choice of language could determine whether this conversation led to resolution or disaster. When James finally broached the subject of the missing jewels, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. Camilla's expression shifted from polite interest to something more guarded, her eyes becoming harder as she realized that this was not going to be another easily deflected inquiry. The witnesses maintained their professional expressions, but James could sense their discomfort as the conversation moved into uncharted territory. James presented his case with military precision, outlining the specific pieces that were missing and the dates they had been borrowed. He spoke respectfully but firmly about the upcoming audit and the potential consequences if the discrepancies were discovered by external investigators. His tone remained deferential throughout, but the underlying message was unmistakable. The missing jewels needed to be returned immediately, and there were no other acceptable options. Camilla's initial response was to question the accuracy of the inventory records, suggesting that there might have been administrative errors or miscommunications about storage locations. She spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her word accepted without question. But James had anticipated this defense and was prepared with detailed documentation. He produced photographs of empty storage locations and copies of signed borrowing agreements that showed her signature on multiple forms. The conversation became increasingly tense as Camilla realized that James would not be satisfied with vague explanations or promises to look into the matter. His evidence was too comprehensive, and his preparation too thorough for the kind of diplomatic deflection that had worked with previous inquiries. She began to show signs of anger, her voice becoming sharper as she questioned James's authority to make such accusations and demanded to know who had authorized this confrontation. James maintained his composure despite the increasing hostility, explaining that his responsibility for the security of the crown jewels gave him both the authority and the obligation to address the situation. He emphasized that he was not making accusations but simply requesting the return of pieces that belonged to the royal collection. His respectful but unwavering tone made it clear that he would not be intimidated or discouraged from pursuing the matter. The turning point came when James mentioned the specific value of the missing pieces and the potential insurance implications. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara alone was worth several £1,000,000, and the total value of all missing items exceeded $10 million. More importantly, he explained that the insurance companies would require a full investigation of any claims, which would inevitably become public knowledge and create exactly the kind of scandal that everyone wanted to avoid. Camilla's reaction to this information revealed that she had not fully understood the financial and legal implications of the situation. Her previous responses suggested that she had viewed the missing jewels as a minor administrative matter that could be resolved through normal palace channels. The realization that external investigators and insurance companies were involved seemed to shock her into a more serious consideration of the crisis. Lady Sarah Morrison, who had remained silent throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke up to ask about the timeline for resolving the situation. James explained that the audit was scheduled to begin the following morning, and that any missing pieces would be immediately noticed by the external investigators. There was no possibility of delaying or managing the audit results once the process began, making immediate action essential. The discussion turned to practical matters of how the pieces could be returned without creating additional complications. James suggested that they could be delivered to his office before the end of the day, allowing him to update the inventory records and ensure that everything was properly documented before the audit began. He emphasized that his only concern was protecting the royal collection and avoiding a public scandal that would damage the monarchy's reputation. Camilla's demeanor shifted as she seemed to realize that James was offering her a way out of the crisis that would preserve her dignity and avoid public embarrassment. His approach had been firm but respectful, making it clear that he was trying to protect the institution rather than attack any individual. The witnesses had heard nothing that could be construed as accusatory or inappropriate, giving her room to resolve the situation without losing face. Sir David Thompson, who had extensive experience with palace protocol, suggested that the matter could be handled as a routine security update rather than an emergency response to missing items. This approach would allow the pieces to be returned without creating additional documentation that might raise questions later. It was a face-saving compromise that addressed everyone's concerns while resolving the immediate crisis. The conversation concluded, with Camilla agreeing to have the missing pieces delivered to James's office before 6 o'clock that evening. She maintained her dignity throughout the discussion, never explicitly admitting to any wrongdoing but accepting the need to resolve the situation quickly and quietly. The formal tone of the meeting had allowed everyone to maintain their professional relationships while addressing a crisis that could have destroyed careers and reputations. As James prepared to leave, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The immediate crisis seemed to be resolved, but he knew that relationships had been strained and that there would likely be consequences for his direct approach. The witnesses had heard everything, creating a permanent record of the confrontation that could be used against him if political winds shifted in the future. The hours between 4 and 6 o'clock felt like the longest of James's career as he waited in his office for the promised delivery. He had cleared his schedule and dismissed his staff early, wanting to handle the return of the jewels personally and with maximum discretion. The leather folder containing his evidence sat open on his desk, ready to be updated with return documentation that would hopefully close this chapter of the crisis forever. At precisely 5:30, there was a soft knock on his office door. Lady Sarah Morrison entered carrying a small but obviously heavy briefcase, her expression carefully neutral as she approached James's desk. Behind her came a palace security officer who served as a witness to the transfer, ensuring that proper protocol was followed even in this unusual situation. The briefcase looked expensive and well-made, the kind used for transporting valuable items with appropriate security. The opening of the briefcase revealed a sight that brought both relief and amazement to James's experienced eyes. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara lay nestled in custom foam padding, its diamonds catching the office lighting and throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. Beside it was the Queen Mother's diamond Riviere necklace, each stone perfectly positioned and gleaming with the fire that made it one of the most beautiful pieces in the royal collection. Lady Sarah began removing items methodically, each piece wrapped in soft cloth and accompanied by its original storage documentation. James recognized every item from his inventory lists: brooches that had belonged to Queen Victoria, earrings worn by Princess Margaret, and a sapphire bracelet that had been a wedding gift to Queen Elizabeth. The total value represented in that small briefcase exceeded his annual salary many times over, but more importantly, these were irreplaceable links to British history. The return process was conducted with the same formality that governed all palace procedures. Each piece was unwrapped, photographed, and checked against the original borrowing documentation. James signed return receipts for every item, while Lady Sarah maintained detailed records of the transfer. The security officer verified each piece against a master list, ensuring that nothing was overlooked or incorrectly documented. As the process continued, James found himself studying Lady Sarah's expression for any hint of what Camilla might be thinking about the day's events. The private secretary maintained her professional demeanor throughout, but he sensed an underlying tension that suggested this had not been an easy afternoon for anyone involved. The speed with which the items had been gathered and returned indicated that they had been readily accessible, raising questions about why the previous inquiries had been met with such evasive responses. The conversation remained strictly professional, focused on the technical details of documenting the returns and updating the inventory systems. Lady Sarah explained that some pieces had been stored in different locations for security reasons, while others had been sent out for cleaning and maintenance. Her explanations were plausible and delivered with conviction, allowing everyone involved to maintain the fiction that this had been a simple administrative misunderstanding rather than something more serious. When the last piece had been documented and secured, James felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he had been carrying for months. The immediate crisis was resolved, and the upcoming audit would find all pieces properly accounted for in their designated storage locations. The scandal that had threatened to engulf the monarchy had been averted through direct action and the willingness of all parties to find a face-saving solution. Lady Sarah's departure was as formal as her arrival, with polite expressions of gratitude for James's discretion and professionalism. She emphasized that the Queen Consort appreciated his dedication to the security of the royal collection and his careful handling of what could have been a very difficult situation. The words carried an undertone that suggested this incident would not be forgotten, but also that it would not be held against him if he continued to handle it appropriately. After the office was empty again, James spent several minutes simply looking at the returned treasures before beginning the process of returning them to their proper storage locations. Each piece told a story of British history and royal tradition, representing not just monetary value, but cultural heritage that belonged to the entire nation. The thought that these irreplaceable artifacts had been at risk made him feel physically ill, but their safe return gave him a sense of accomplishment that made all the stress worthwhile. The secure vault beneath Buckingham Palace felt like a sanctuary as James carefully placed each piece in its designated location. The climate-controlled environment and multiple security systems provided protection that had been refined over decades of experience with priceless artifacts. As he updated the inventory computer system, James reflected on how close they had come to a disaster that could have damaged the monarchy's reputation for generations. That evening, James called Sir Michael to report the successful resolution of the crisis. The relief in the private secretary's voice was palpable as he thanked James for his handling of the situation and confirmed that the upcoming audit could proceed without complications. They both understood that the crisis had revealed weaknesses in the inventory system that would need to be addressed, but those improvements could be made quietly without drawing unwanted attention. The conversation touched briefly on the potential consequences of the day's events. Sir Michael suggested that James might want to request a transfer to a different position within the palace hierarchy, not as punishment, but as a way of reducing potential friction with Camilla and her staff. It was practical advice delivered with genuine concern for James's career prospects, but it also highlighted the reality that challenging powerful people always carried a price. James declined the suggestion, explaining that his commitment to protecting the royal collection remained as strong as ever. He had served 3 monarchs with distinction and had no intention of allowing one difficult situation to drive him from a position he loved. The crisis had been resolved honorably, and he was confident that his actions had been motivated by loyalty to the institution rather than personal animosity toward any individual. As he prepared for bed that night, James felt a sense of closure that had been missing for months. The missing jewels had been returned, the audit would proceed smoothly, and the monarchy had been protected from a scandal that could have been devastating. His career might face some challenges in the coming months, but he had done his duty according to his conscience and his oath of service. The following morning would bring the formal audit, but James was confident that the investigators would find everything in perfect order. The crisis that had consumed his thoughts and threatened his sleep was finally over, allowing him to return to the normal duties that had made his career so rewarding. The audit proceeded exactly as James had hoped, with the Royal Collection Trust investigators finding every piece properly accounted for and securely stored. The team of experts spent 3 days conducting their thorough examination, using advanced equipment to verify authenticity and condition while updating their comprehensive database. James accompanied them throughout the process, answering questions and providing access to documentation with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. The lead investigator, Dr. Margaret Hartwell, was a renowned expert in royal jewelry who had been conducting these audits for over 15 years. Her methodical approach and keen eye for detail had uncovered irregularities in the past, making her approval particularly valuable for James's peace of mind. When she complimented him on the meticulous condition of the inventory records and the obvious care taken in storing the pieces, James felt a surge of professional pride that made all the recent stress worthwhile. However, the resolution of the immediate crisis did not mean that life at Buckingham Palace returned to normal. The confrontation with Camilla had created ripples throughout the palace hierarchy that continued to affect James's daily routine in subtle but unmistakable ways. Invitations to certain meetings stopped arriving, and some colleagues began treating him with a cooler formality that suggested word of the incident had spread despite everyone's efforts at discretion. The most significant change came in the form of a new directive regarding the borrowing procedures for crown jewels. Sir Michael announced that all future loans would require approval from both the private secretary's office and the commander of the Royal Guard, with additional documentation and shortened borrowing periods. The changes were presented as routine security updates, but James understood that they were a direct result of the recent crisis and represented an institutional response to prevent similar problems in the future. King Charles himself requested a private meeting with James 3 weeks after the audit was completed. The encounter took place in the king's private study, a room filled with books, artwork, and personal mementos that reflected his diverse interests and long preparation for the throne. Charles appeared genuinely concerned about the situation and grateful for James's discretion in handling such a delicate matter. The conversation revealed that the king had been aware of the missing jewels but had hoped that the situation could be resolved without the kind of direct confrontation that James had ultimately deemed necessary. Charles expressed his appreciation for James's loyalty to the institution, while acknowledging the difficult position that events had placed him in. There was no criticism of James's actions, but the king's measured words suggested that he understood the political complexities that such incidents created within the royal family. James took the opportunity to present his own perspective on the crisis, explaining his growing concern about the missing pieces and his belief that institutional loyalty sometimes required difficult decisions. He emphasized that his actions had been motivated by a desire to protect the monarchy rather than to embarrass or attack any individual. The king listened thoughtfully, asking occasional questions that demonstrated his genuine interest in understanding James's reasoning. The meeting concluded with Charles expressing his confidence in James's continued service and his hope that the recent difficulties would not discourage him from maintaining his high standards. However, the king also suggested that future situations requiring such delicate handling might benefit from earlier consultation with senior advisors. It was gentle guidance rather than criticism, but it highlighted the complex balancing act required when institutional duty conflicted with personal relationships. In the weeks that followed, James began to notice subtle changes in how Camilla and her staff interacted with him during official functions. The queen consort remained polite but distant, acknowledging his presence with the kind of formal courtesy that indicated their professional relationship had been permanently altered. Her staff followed her lead, maintaining appropriate respect while clearly keeping their interactions to the minimum required by protocol. The changes were not limited to Camilla's immediate circle. Other members of the royal family seemed to be treating James with a new wariness that suggested they viewed him as someone willing to challenge authority when circumstances warranted. This reputation was not entirely unwelcome to James, who had always believed that respect was more important than popularity in his line of work. However, it did make certain aspects of his duties more challenging, as people became more guarded in their interactions with him. The most significant consequence emerged during a routine security briefing when James learned that his name was being considered for early retirement with full honors. The suggestion came from senior palace administrators who argued that his distinguished service record warranted recognition and that a graceful exit might benefit everyone involved. The proposal was presented as an opportunity rather than a requirement, but James understood the subtle pressure behind the offer. James spent considerable time weighing this option, recognizing that accepting early retirement would resolve many of the political complications created by the jewel crisis. He would leave with his reputation intact and his pension secure, avoiding any future conflicts that might arise from his willingness to challenge authority. It was an attractive option that would allow him to end his career on a high note, while removing a potential source of tension from the palace environment. However, the more James considered the retirement option, the more determined he became to continue serving. His actions during the jewel crisis had been motivated by the same principles that had guided his entire career, and retiring now would feel like an admission that he had done something wrong. The crown jewels were safer because of his intervention, and the monarchy had been protected from a potentially devastating scandal. These outcomes validated his decision to act, regardless of any personal consequences. The resolution came during another private conversation with Sir Michael, who had continued to support James despite the political complications his actions had created. The private secretary acknowledged that James's intervention had been necessary and effective, preventing a crisis that could have damaged the monarchy's reputation for years. He also recognized that forcing James into retirement would send the wrong message about institutional values and the importance of principled leadership. The final decision was that James would continue in his position with the understanding that future sensitive situations would be handled through established channels whenever possible. It was a compromise that acknowledged both the necessity of his recent actions and the need to maintain harmony within the palace hierarchy. James accepted these terms gratefully, understanding that he had been given a second chance to serve the institution he loved. 6 months after the jewel crisis, James found himself reflecting on how profoundly the experience had changed, both his perspective on palace life and his understanding of institutional loyalty. The daily routines of his position had resumed their familiar rhythm, but beneath the surface everything felt different. The naive trust he had once placed in the system had been replaced by a more mature understanding of the complex forces that shaped royal life. Behind the public facade, the new borrowing procedures for crown jewels had become standard practice, with additional layers of oversight that prevented any repetition of the previous crisis. James took particular satisfaction in these improvements, knowing that his difficult decision to confront Camilla had led to systemic changes that would protect the royal collection for future generations. The enhanced security measures were a lasting legacy of his willingness to challenge authority when institutional interests were at stake. Camilla's behavior toward James had settled into a pattern of cool professionalism that both parties found workable. During state functions and official ceremonies, she acknowledged his presence with appropriate courtesy, while maintaining the emotional distance that their confrontation had created. James respected this arrangement, understanding that some relationships could not be fully repaired, but could evolve into sustainable working partnerships based on mutual respect for professional boundaries. The most unexpected consequence of the crisis had been the enhanced reputation James had gained among the palace staff who were responsible for maintaining and protecting royal property. Word of his principled stand had spread through the lower ranks of the organization, creating a new level of respect for his leadership and commitment to institutional values. Younger guards and security personnel began seeking his advice on ethical dilemmas, recognizing him as someone who had proven willing to sacrifice personal comfort for professional integrity. King Charles had continued to treat James with the respect and confidence that their private conversation had established. During their regular security briefings, the king often asked for James's perspective on matters that went beyond his immediate responsibilities, clearly valuing his judgment and institutional memory. This enhanced relationship had become one of the most rewarding aspects of James's continued service, providing opportunities to contribute to the monarchy's evolution in ways he had never anticipated. The media attention that James had feared during the crisis had never materialized, thanks to the successful resolution and the discretion of everyone involved. The Royal Collection Trust had published their routine audit report without any mention of irregularities or special circumstances, maintaining the public facade that everything had proceeded normally. This outcome validated James's belief that direct action, when properly executed, could resolve problems without creating the scandals that everyone had feared. The personal cost of the confrontation had been significant, but manageable. James had lost some friendships within the palace hierarchy and had been excluded from certain social circles that had once welcomed him. However, these losses had been offset by new relationships with colleagues who respected his integrity and by a deeper sense of personal satisfaction with his professional choices. He had learned that doing the right thing often came with a price, but that the alternative was usually far worse. As James approached his 60th birthday, he began considering his long-term plans for retirement and succession. The jewel crisis had demonstrated the importance of having principled leaders in key positions within the palace hierarchy, and he wanted to ensure that his eventual replacement would share his commitment to institutional integrity. He began mentoring younger officers who showed promise, sharing the lessons he had learned about balancing loyalty to individuals with loyalty to the broader institution. The relationship between institutional duty and personal relationships remained a complex challenge that James continued to navigate carefully. The jewel crisis had taught him that sometimes these loyalties conflicted in ways that required difficult choices, but it had also shown him that principled action could strengthen institutions even when it strained personal relationships. This balance required constant attention and careful judgment, but it was essential for maintaining the integrity that made the monarchy worthy of public trust and support. James's experience had also provided valuable insights into the pressures and temptations that affected even the most well-intentioned members of the royal family. The isolation and privilege of royal life could distort perspective and create blind spots about the broader implications of seemingly personal decisions. Understanding these dynamics had made James more effective in his protective role, allowing him to anticipate problems before they became crises. The enhanced security protocols that had emerged from the crisis extended beyond the crown jewels to other aspects of royal property and protocol. James had been instrumental in developing these improvements, drawing on his experience to create systems that were both effective and respectful of royal prerogatives. The result was a more robust framework for protecting institutional assets while maintaining the flexibility that royal life required. As James looked toward the future, he felt confident that his decision to confront Camilla had been vindicated by its results. The crown jewels were more secure, the borrowing procedures were more transparent, and the monarchy had been protected from a scandal that could have undermined public confidence for years. The personal cost had been real but acceptable, especially when weighed against the institutional benefits that had been achieved. The experience had also reinforced James's belief in the importance of the monarchy as an institution that transcended any individual, no matter how powerful or privileged. The crown jewels belonged to the nation, not to any person, and protecting them was a sacred trust that required vigilance and courage. His willingness to fulfill this trust, even when it created personal difficulties, had strengthened both his own integrity and the institution he served. In quiet moments, James sometimes wondered what would have happened if he had chosen the safer path of diplomatic silence and allowed the audit to expose the missing jewels. The resulting scandal would have dominated headlines for months, creating exactly the kind of crisis that the monarchy could least afford during its transition to a new reign. His intervention had prevented this outcome, protecting not just the royal family but the broader institution that millions of people around the world continued to respect and admire.